תודה שהזמנתם אותי לדבר היום. It's wonderful to be here with all of you, and it's a big privilege to speak today. So I thank you both for the invitation to do so. Thank you for that warm introduction. And as Gadi mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and this concept of moral injury is very near and dear to my heart as well. My parents both served in the Israeli military, and for pretty much my whole career, I've worked with veterans who are coming back from war in the US. I worked first in the Boston VA and for many years now in the San Francisco VA system, which is the main hospital where we take care of veterans. And I wanted to speak a little bit about my own experience and how I got interested in the topic of moral injury in particular. So I began working at the Boston VA in September of 2001, and just as the attacks were happening, the terrorist attacks were happening, and for many years I was there and saw veterans coming back, and I was trained in PTSD treatment in PE and CPT, and we gave those treatments, and they were helpful to many vets. And yet, what I was observing from my own clinical experience was that there was something that was missing in the treatment of veterans who were coming back. So at the time, I was working with one veteran who had killed a child in war, and he really struggled with that, and really struggled with what it meant for him to kill a child in war and then to come back home to his own child. I also worked with another veteran at the time who was trained as a medic, and this particular veteran had to, in the context of saving someone in the context of war, also killed someone. And this was very difficult for him to integrate the parts of his identity of the warrior and also of someone who was a medical professional. So I began to really think about moral injury in that context back then, and it felt like the treatments that we had at the time didn't go quite far enough in addressing some of the spiritual issues that were coming up, some of the identity and existential issues that were coming up for people, and issues around their own morals and values, and how for many people they felt that by killing someone in war they had crossed a line. And so that's really where my journey began, to try and help veterans, the veterans that I was seeing in clinic, the veterans who I was trying to help, and I felt like we needed to do better in their treatment. And so that's where my research began. A lot of the research that I focused on really has to do with killing in war as one example of moral injury. And that's a lot of where I'm going to focus today. I'm going to share with you data from some focus groups that we did to understand this issue. I'm also going to share with you a treatment that we developed over time to fill some of the gaps that I just talked about that we were observing. And this particular treatment is dealing with the impact of killing in war as a type of moral injury. And we specifically do this treatment after, we see this as a later phase treatment. So we give it to people when they've had some kind of trauma-focused treatment. So talking about their trauma in some context before we do this treatment. So I'm excited to share all of that with you today. I'm going to share some slides with you. And I'm going to start here. So this is, let's see, so I'm going to just start sharing. And can you all see my slides? Okay, great. So this is, here are some examples that some of which I've spoken about that I came across. I know that Gadi and Yossi have done a wonderful job defining moral injury, talking about the theoretical model. So I'm going to just dive right into some examples that I've witnessed in my work with American veterans. So I spoke about shooting a child who poses life threat, and in the veteran that I saw in particular, this was his experience very early in my career that really urged me to do some of this work. And I think that that can be very haunting for people, especially when their own children are reminders of those who were killed in war. So that can happen, those reminders can happen on a daily basis. Another example that I've heard quite frequently with veterans who I've worked with is not being able to correctly identify the enemy. So sometimes you're working very closely with civilians. You think someone is there to support you. It turns out that they're there to harm you, and how you react to that is very challenging. So sometimes people kill in the context of war, or are harmed, or witness other people harmed in that specific circumstance. So another example is killing someone in war who is suffering and has low odds of survival. And so we work with multiple medics as well who suffer from moral injury, who have maybe not saved someone because they know that they have to deal with many injured people, and they let some people die in the context of war because they know they don't have enough resources or time to save everyone, and they remember those people and they see their faces. Another example is failing to act in a way that results in the death of a fellow soldier. So we talk about moral injury in terms of acts of omission and acts of commission. So acts of omission is what you fail to do that causes you great distress. And acts of commission are things like killing, where you do things that cause you distress. So in this particular instance, when you fail to act in a way that results in the death of a soldier. So I've talked to veterans who have had the experience where they knew someone maybe was harmful, but they doubted their instinct for a moment, and then someone the result was someone dying. And so that's something that they suffer with. And that's an example of an act of omission. And finally, another example is witnessing the death of others and feeling helpless to act. So we talked to a number of people who saw Afghani or Iraqi women and children being murdered, and couldn't act, and felt very, very bad about that because they felt that it went against their morals and values of helping civilians, and they were there to help some of the people that they witnessed dying. So I want to start by just sort of sharing some data about killing in war in particular. So what we know from research is that 77 to 87% of American Operation Iraqi Freedom soldiers reported directing fire at the enemy, and about half reported being responsible for the death of an enemy combatant. About 14 to 28% reported being responsible for the death of a non-combatant, so a civilian, a woman, child, or a civilian man. So given these frequencies, and I think the important part here is, that a lot of times when you fire a weapon, you don't always know how that ends up. But for some people, they imagine the worst case scenario, and that really haunts them for many, many years. And so you don't necessarily have to know that you killed in war to suffer from that. And in fact, I've worked with many pilots who were responsible for dropping bombs, and they imagine what they did, even though they never saw what they did. And that continues to haunt them. So what we know is that veterans from many eras who kill in war are at increased risk of PTSD, alcohol abuse, suicide, and functional difficulties. And what I mean by functional difficulties are things like relationship problems, difficulty at work, difficulty doing day-to-day activities, self-sabotaging behaviors. So things like, I killed in war and I took another life, and as a result, I don't deserve to be happy. I don't deserve to have my own family and have some of the good things in life. So those kinds of thoughts that people carry with them for a long time after the war is over. And so I'm very happy to share the research that we have done. I have some citations down below, but we've done work over a number of years that have shown pretty consistently that that those who kill in war are at higher risk. We also know that there are people who kill in war who don't have issues, and many of those people, particularly if they feel like they are justified and that they were able to save people may not struggle, but there are plenty of those who do and who experience moral injury. We also know that killing is not routinely assessed in our healthcare systems and not by the Department of Defense. So no one ever asks about those experiences. And so it's very difficult sometimes to identify people, and they come to us because we notice that they have moral injury. And that's a lot of times how we see them. As I talked about before, our evidence-based treatments for PTSD, for a long time, people with moral injury were only treated with those because we didn't have other treatments. Now there are a number of treatments, including the one that I'll talk about today, which is the impact of killing treatment that we developed. There are a number of treatments now from a number of really wonderful investigators who are testing out new treatments for moral injury. And so I think the future holds great promise in terms of being able to better treat moral injury, but there's really not a clear treatment trajectory after evidence-based psychotherapies for PTSD for those who continue to be impaired by killing in war. So I want to share a little bit, I'm just going to let the veterans' voices come alive a little bit and share with you a few instances of what veterans shared with us in the focus groups. And I'll talk about two themes in particular that emerged when we were talking about killing and the impact of war. So one is this idea about the dark side of the self. And what veterans felt was that when they killed, they saw this part of themselves that not many people have to see. And they called it the dark side of the self. So this is one veteran shared, you kind of feel like a monster. What I am capable of doing is what scares me. So the fact that he killed and he witnessed that in himself, it caused him to not only feel like a monster, but feel like he became scared of his own anger, in addition to having the experience of killing. So that's the dark side of the self that came out. The other really important piece that came out is morality. And this was a veteran, these are veterans' voices and what they shared about morality. And I think this is most related to the topic of moral injury. I'll share one of the quotations and read it out loud. One veteran said, "I think you feel ashamed of what you did. You know you're trained to do it and that it just stays with you. I guess I feel very sad sometimes. I feel proud to be a soldier who tried to do something that I thought was right for the country. But it's hard to be a soldier. It tears away from your moral fiber. It changes your life." Right? So there's this idea here that you try to do what's right, but you're going to, in this particular case, he had to kill in war, and he felt like it really tore from his moral fiber and who he was as a person, and his life was changed after that, and there wasn't any going back. I want to very briefly talk about why killing trauma is different than how we particularly think about typical PTSD trauma. So, and this has a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about later on in just a moment about treatment. So with PTSD trauma, the violence from the other person is directed at the self. While with killing trauma, the violence from the self is directed at another person. So it's a very, very different type of situation. It's really, the violence is coming from within the individual. With PTSD trauma, as many of you know, there is many of the existing treatments such as CPT and PE are based in a fear-based model to trauma. So, we know that with killing trauma, it's much more complex. So there's some fear. So killing can definitely happen in the context of fear. But oftentimes what happens is there's a lot of loss that happens right before killing trauma. So there's loss of loved ones or close comrades. There's a lot of anger that happens, and that sometimes, not always, but sometimes killing can occur in the context of revenge, right? So there's a lot of complex emotions that can go into killing trauma. With killing trauma, the person is a participant in the trauma, they're activated, and what can follow is moral conflict. Whereas with PTSD trauma, the person is often a recipient of the trauma. There can be helplessness and self-protection. So, and we can see here from this model, there's a lot of overlap in addition to that. I'm going to talk a moment here, and I'm going to stop sharing just for a little bit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about moral injury and survivor guilt in particular. So I know that typically when we think of survivor guilt in the context of PTSD, it's about fellow service members who didn't get to survive, right? So it's about the loss of comrades, of those who are close to you, fellow soldiers. With moral injury, the survivor's guilt is about those who were killed in war, and the individual feels guilty that they survived and the people who they killed, the person or the people who they killed, did not get to survive, right? And there's a deep shame about that. And shame and guilt, as we know, are some of the hallmark symptoms of moral injury in particular. So when I was doing some of the focus groups, one veteran really described this as taking away someone else's soul, right? And we've heard this too when we've done the treatment. So veterans who suffer from moral injury feel oftentimes when they kill that they have taken away someone else's life, someone else's soul. And oftentimes they also fear that their family is going to be harmed in return. So a veteran who I worked with very closely was incredibly terrified that because he killed in war, even though the people who he killed were very far away, they would come back. There would be some kind of retribution, that someone would come back and harm his family and take away the thing that was most precious to him. And this notion of karmic retribution is very common with moral injury. And the idea is that you did something bad, you did something that took something away from someone else, and that's going to come back to harm you in some way. This is the idea that the scales need to be rebalanced. Some veterans have talked about righting the wrong that has been done. And this really emerges as thoughts about not deserving to be happy, not deserving to have a family when they have deprived someone else of these things. So I think that that's we always look for issues with functioning in veterans who are suffering from moral injury. How are they not functioning to the best of their potential? So I think that that's, again, we were talking about some of the hallmark symptoms of PTSD. Functioning is always something that I look for when I'm looking for, can this person benefit from treatment? And then I think that these feelings around not deserving to be happy often emerge during major life milestones, such as getting married, having your first child, other successes that people tend to experience in life. So I think that that's something that I typically look for. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing. So give me a moment here. Okay, so I am going to talk now about how we treat moral injury in particular. And I'm just in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the impact of killing treatment that we've developed, although as I mentioned before, there are now many treatments in development for moral injury. So I think that moral injury treatments really go beyond a diagnosis, and they recognize that moral injury is multidimensional and contains a spiritual component. So I think one of the things that really distinguishes moral injury treatments is delving into some of these existential issues that people experience and their sense of spirituality, right? So questions around where was God when this happens, feeling like they distance themselves from their own spirituality. And I very intentionally use the word spirituality because I think that it's important to recognize that that can look very different for people. For some people, it's about religion, but for other people, it really is a much broader sense of spirituality. So I think that when we think about treating moral injury, it's very important to build bridges with families, with cultural communities, within which the veteran is embedded. So we can't, as therapists, we can't do this work in a vacuum. And it's very, very important. This is one of my favorite bridges because I live in San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge. But I think that building these bridges is very important because it it recognizes that we need help and we need the support of family members and friends and the culture to do this kind of work. So we have to acknowledge that the mental health piece is only one piece of the puzzle, and we have to work within all the resources that we have to do this work. So I'm going to talk specifically about the impact of killing treatment. And while we think about IOK, or the impact of killing treatment, as a CBT-based treatment, a cognitive behavioral therapy-based treatments, we very much draw from many types of theories. So we draw from existential theories, we draw from interpersonal theories and family systems as well. And I very much think in terms of multiple theories in my own work, and certainly we did that too in developing IOK treatment. So a dear colleague of mine, Chris Berkman, and I worked on this treatment together. And the idea with IOK is that this is a treatment that is designed to be done after some trauma work. So in terms of the past trauma work, it doesn't have to be their killing incident. And IOK in particular is designed to be about 10 sessions, and the sessions last 60 to 90 minutes. I will mention too, and I'll present some of the work from our pilot trial. We are now doing a research study with multi-site trial where we're doing this treatment in New York and also in North Carolina too, with veterans there. So excited to present some of this work. So how is the impact of killing treatment different than what we typically see with PTSD treatments? What's really important in the impact of killing treatment is that we ask veterans how, in their own voices, to express to us what are some of the ways in which they have been challenged in their day-to-day lives. And we have a particular measure that we've designed called the Killing Cognition Scale that gets at some of the ways in which people are thinking about their killing. So we ask about guilt-related cognitions, shame-related cognitions, thoughts about disgust and feeling like they're contaminated in some way, spirituality-based cognition. So we really ask about a very, very wide range of cognitions. And these cognitions specifically came out of the focus groups that I presented earlier on, that I just got to present a little bit out of those. But those cognitions very much come from the veterans and their voices, and they're sharing with us how they experienced the impact of killing. So we start by understanding for each veteran, how are their struggles and how are their cognitions unique? And what we found in this treatment is that some veterans really struggle with shame about what they did. For others, the core issues are really about spirituality and about this notion of not being able to self-forgive. So how is IOK different than treatments that we typically do? So while, for example, in cognitive behavioral therapies, a lot of the focus is on challenging thoughts, here we believe that while we can look at the context of what happens, a lot of what we do is work on acceptance. So there has to be an acknowledgement that for many veterans, they crossed a line, right? So from the model that was presented earlier, a transgression has occurred, and we have to acknowledge that for that individual, we cannot explain that away, and we absolutely have to meet them where they're at, and that we say, absolutely, you crossed the line for yourself, and we have to start there, right? So that's a critical part of IOK. And we know that when we don't do that with veterans, it doesn't feel authentic to them, right? So we have to acknowledge that a harm was done and a wrong was done, and name that. That is very important. The other way in which IOK is different is we talk very specifically about spiritual and moral concerns. So we want to understand how these show up for the veterans. What's the line that was crossed? How does that affect their spirituality? How do they understand that in the context of what their spirituality is? The next piece is that we deal with, and much of the treatment is focused on self-forgiveness. The model that you saw earlier, forgiveness is kind of a critical part of that model. And we believe that if we don't deal directly with self-forgiveness, we can't sort of make strides forward with moral injury. And so this has to be, we have to understand, where ideas about forgiveness come from. We have to understand what the barriers are, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also have to acknowledge that self-forgiveness is a process. It's a long process, and this is really going to be a starting point for that journey. In Iok, we do tailored letter writing. I'm going to talk a lot more about that, but it's a very active treatment where there are multiple letters that we ask veterans to write. We also, a goal of Iok is to make connections and to think about what amends is a very important concept in Iok. And the idea behind amends is that you are doing things that are now consistent with your values, right? So if your values are to, to reconnect with your community, if your values are around, righting the wrong that was done, for some people, they do certain rituals and that's part of their amends plan. For others, they reconnect with nature. So idea behind amends is that you are doing things in your life to live a life more consistent with your values specifically. And then the last part of Iok is we see Iok as a catalyst rather than a resolution. So the idea is that this is a springboard in which we kind of get to talk about these things, but we really leave the veteran at a place where we come up with a self-forgiveness plan with the veteran. And so we want to make sure that they understand that this is ongoing work. We have done the first part of the work and they're going to continue to do the work on their own, and we set them up for that. I wanted to go back to the challenge versus acceptance piece and really recognize here that with Iok, we recognize that a personal or collective line was crossed. We also want to really be clear that the event is based in a firm grounding of what happened. The veteran is clear about what happened and they know they crossed the line. And the idea with acceptance is that the event needs to be integrated rather than understood through a different lens, right? So we're not going to challenge what happened. We are going to try to understand the context. If the pieces of the context are missing, we are going to try to understand that. And we're going to be attending to any confusion if there's an incomplete story. So those are things that we absolutely do in Iok. So I think an important part about can therapists treat moral injury is needing to be clear about your own relationships with spirituality and watch for any bias that comes up. We can explore the spiritual conflict, but we're not a spiritual counselor, right? And that's not really our goal, but we are opening the door to saying we believe that this is actually part of what we have to look at if you're going to heal, and provide the grounds to do that. We understand that part of healing is a therapist bearing witness to the killing. So, for many of the veterans that we work with, this is the first time that they've shared their killing experiences. And we believe that part of the healing is actually bearing witness to the stories that people are telling, and that that really we are witnessing the dark side that people are describing. And we are also acknowledging that everyone has a dark side, and that veterans who kill and war specifically got to see that dark side in a very explicit way, but that dark side is something that exists, and that's an important part of acknowledging what happened to people in the context of war. So this is a quote from a veteran who has written about moral injury. When we talk about moral injury, we seek a deeper understanding of our humanity. We seek healing in some spiritual sense, right? So there's acknowledgement that, we all have a moral compass, and we can understand what it means to cross a line, and that's the context in which moral injury healing can occur. I want to share, this is the 10-session treatment overview. I'm going to have, to kind of talk about some of the highlights here. And I think that what's really important is that I can share with you that, that these 10 sessions again, really feel like a beginning to the work. And so what we do in the beginning is talk about what they have done in the past, what the barriers to treatment has been, and how they've coped, right? So like we would do to any other treatment. In sessions 2 and 3, we really focus on common responses to killing. So we want to normalize for people that there is a certain physiological response that happens when people kill in war. They have to make very quick and difficult decisions. And they also have some initial reactions, which are very complicated. A lot of times people get stuck on the fact that because they had a reaction to killing, that adrenaline rush, they mistake that rush for some enjoyment or some kind of, there's some confusion about what that means. And so we really like to first do some education about what happens in your body around the physiology of killing. In the third session, we talk about how beliefs, emotions, and behaviors are connected. And again, we do that in the context of the killing cognition scales that I described earlier. We really are able to look at those killing cognitions in much greater detail. So for example, if someone has the belief that, that they feel extremely guilty about killing, we'll try to understand that in this in these sessions, in these next sessions. And we really want to understand what is keeping the person stuck, right? And we look at the fact that for a lot of people, they've been living, we've worked with Korea, we've worked with World War II and Korea War veterans who have been stuck for a very, very long time. We also worked with Vietnam veterans, and we work with, post 9/11 veterans or veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we really see a very, very wide range of veterans in this treatment. And what's incredible is just how much of what they're struggling with is common around moral injury. So session 6 is really about acceptance, and that's what we were talking about earlier, that we want to acknowledge that that people might have crossed a line, to really talk that through. Also acknowledge the role of betrayal and moral injury, and what happens when someone experiences moral injury, and what happens to their lives and what happens to their families, and really take a look at how people have been impacted very specifically. To me, the self-forgiveness sessions are some of the critical part of the work that we do. This is a really important piece because I think that we very systematically and methodically work up to the self-forgiveness work. So I don't think that that work can be done in a vacuum. You have to develop all of these pieces in a relationship working up to this, because I think otherwise it falls flat. So I always like to make that point, because it is so much of the crux of the work, and yet without the building blocks that come before, the work can really fall flat. So I think that by the time we get to this part of the treatment, the veteran has felt comfortable talking about this, getting to know us, letting us in. And so we can talk about looking at what self-forgiveness means to them, and where their ideas about self-forgiveness have come from, where they've gotten stuck with that. And we talk to them about the fact that we're going to build a forgiveness plan with them. So that's kind of a critical part of the work here. So what we do is really focus on areas of forgiveness. And so they kind of identify what are the areas that they need to work on in terms of their own forgiveness after we define each of these pieces. And we want to understand what role has not being able to forgive themselves played in their life, right? When we understand how forgiveness functions for them in that context, we assign them a series of letters. And this is where things can get very intense for people. And so one of the letters that we assign them is specifically writing a letter to the person or the people who they killed. And these letters are often, very intense, and asking for forgiveness in particular. So these letters are long, and oftentimes it takes a few times for the veteran to be able to write that letter. We review it, we have them read the letter out loud. And again, if we think about going back to witnessing, we are witnessing sort of some of the self-forgiveness that they are putting into action through writing this letter. The next letter that we assign is the goal of that letter is to really have them step outside of their own stuckness and witness, we have them write a letter to themselves from someone who knows them, who is beloved to them, and who can take a different perspective. So the key here with the second letter is being able to take another perspective. And, for some people, that's going to be a letter from a family member, a letter from someone who they served with, who knows them very well. So we work with people to really structure that letter and figure out who they want that letter to be from. And the last letter is a letter from a younger version of themselves, to a younger version of themselves, from the older version of themselves. So, right, they're writing the letter from their perspective, sharing with that younger version of themselves what they wanted to share with. And again, the idea here is that now, from an older version of themselves, they can sort of have compassion for that younger version of themselves. So a big part of this treatment is, again, trying to shift perspective, trying to have that compassion for that younger version of themselves, knowing what they know now. Right. So I think that that's also very, very powerful. And sometimes we have them bring in pictures of the younger version of themselves so they can look and get in that mind space. So again, key issues here: delving into self-forgiveness, delving into altering perspectives, and delving into self-compassion. So the next session is really about thinking about making amends and the connection to others. So making amends is really, again, about thinking out loud with the veteran about what they want to do to make things better for their lives, to live a life that's consistent with their values. For a lot of veterans, we had one veteran who wanted to have, the people who he killed, he basically wanted to have a specific ritual that involved, being at sea and doing a certain ritual around the meaning of what happened in war. And, the particular people were killed in the water. And so he wanted to have a ritual that was specifically in the water and asking them for forgiveness, right? So that's just one example of making amends. A lot of people, the veterans that we worked with, have traveled back to Vietnam to be on the land where they killed, to kind of make amends. And for other veterans, making amends is about being in nature and sharing that maybe with their children, with their families, and reconnecting with some of those values that are important to them. So the last session is really about maintaining gains. And that is the idea that healing is a process, and really coming up with a plan to do continued work specifically. So, we want to make sure that all the gains that they've made around the forgiveness, around the amends, around some of these gains that they hold near and dear to their hearts, we want to make sure that those get continued and that they think about a plan for that moving forward. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. I know we are getting short on time, and I'm glad I got to share sort of what that treatment looks like. I have some more slides, but I think in the interest of time, what I can do is just sort of briefly share that, we have specifically done a pilot trial of Iok. We found that when we did that pilot trial, people improved tremendously in terms of PTSD, but not only in terms of PTSD, but also in terms of depression, in terms of anxiety, a number of different functional outcomes they improved on as well. So what we found that is in those 33 people, we really saw tremendous gains. And again, like I mentioned, we are doing a trial now that's a multi-site trial with veterans from multiple areas who have killed in war. So I'm going to stop there and just sort of check in. Like I said, I have more slides, so I can definitely keep going. But I think maybe what we can do is turn to questions in the interest of time. What do you think, Gadi and Yossi?